we're not sure of a situation, it's in our nature to wonder about it. We wonder about all sorts of things, even sometimes to worry about them. We are naturally inquisitive creatures. And then some things may be concerning because we're not quite sure. We really can't be sure. So, many people wonder about how we fit into our universe and how our approach to religion affects all this. I'm not usually that negative about things, but some things do concern me, and people just not caring is one of those. And not caring about life at all, that certainly is concerning. Particularly those who take a selfish or a thoughtless approach. We come across them all too often, some at the wheels of cars and elsewhere. Many, though, being serious, resort to expressing views which they haven't really thought out, or which they've just picked from somebody else and they have no real basis or proof or rationale for those things. Now, why should that be of concern to us? Because we are made by God as logical, reasoning beings and should use that in our decision making. So we come to this afternoon's question. How do we know that we are not alone? Well, I'm going to dismiss, out of hand, speculative ideas which don't have any real basis. You say, but what if we put AI to work? Well, I did. And AI confirms that finds there is no confirmed evidence of extraterrestrial life. But there are intriguing signs. One of these, and I quote, involves DMS, dimethyl sulfide, which on Earth is a molecule primarily produced by marine life. But this sign, we're told, remains tentative, requiring further observation for further confirmation. Observation, confirmation. Well, astronomers therefore caution against definitively claiming evidence of life at this stage. But this potential biosignature of DMS, where is it in our massive universe? Well, has been found in the atmosphere of exoplanet K2-18b. No, I hadn't heard of it before either. Where is K2-18b? It's 124 light years away. How far is that away? How far is that in kilometres? 1,173 times 10 to the power 15. 1173 times 10 to the 15. Well, the 1173 bit, let's deal with that. That's fairly straightforward. When I first thought about this, I imagined a journey of something of that order. It's the sort of thing that people might do for a business trip or for some other reason. So, for instance, I discovered that roughly it's about the distance from Paris to Venice. Or when our Iranian friends are around, I would say it's from Tehran to Tbilisi. Intriguingly, I later found that 1,173 kilometres, according to Google, this is by road, not by as the crow flies, it's exactly the distance from Bournemouth to John O'Groats. Now, having said it's from Bournemouth to John O'Groats, and I don't think any of us could easily imagine a consultant or somebody just seeking work travelling weekly from Bournemouth to John O'Groats and back for work. It's a long way, we would say. But just imagine, for sake of argument, Okay, let's do Paris, Venice. Probably a better train journey anyway. Imagine doing that return trip every week for work for 2 whole years. There, here, there, every week. Actually, that wouldn't get you very far towards this exoplanet. You'd need to do it for 2 trillion years every week to get that far. That's how far away this possible find of a chemical is located. There's even less evidence for UFOs. Now let's just think about this in terms of that being all there is at the moment in a universe of the size of ours. And let's just think about the science of the universe. Well, let's start with planet Earth for a start. I'm not going to tell the whole story, Sister Carol, don't worry. But once, in fact, it was the first Macedonian Bible school, Brother Andrew Johnson was speaking, and he was explaining in one of the sessions about the wonderful way in which God has placed planet Earth just in the right place in our solar system, within the universe, for life to be as we find it. And that science is fascinating. And he quoted a book about this, and it refers to Earth as being in the Goldilocks position. Not too far from the sun, not too near to the sun, just right. And so many other things that are just right for planet Earth. The problem was, of course, that our Macedonian brethren had never heard the story of Goldilocks. Oh, go on, I will then. And Brother Lambay, our late Brother Lambay, who was the original Christadelphian in that area, even before the CBM arrived with the campaign, normally was a cheerful sort of chappie, but very dour in his interpreting work. Until Brother Andrew got to the bit about Baby Bear. And then Brother Lambay went into... I've never known him get so excited about a bit of translation. But that made the point about Goldilocks. The fact that this Earth is in exactly the right place in so many ways for science to say all the factors are right for life. And then you think of all the work in... some of you may be familiar with some of Brother John Thorpe's work, and his... I've got somewhere a copy of his 50-page PDF on science of creation. And there are so many things in there. Just absolutely amazing what is right for life. And the answers are staring us in the face. This is absolutely perfect. And when we open our Bibles, we realize that God has done what he needed to. He placed the life he was designing in the right place in the universe. And now, thinking about God and his ways, we realize, of course, that these scriptures have been with us for thousands of years and explaining this to any who would listen. Peter talks about those who are willingly ignorant. If you don't want to know or believe, just ignore it. Just look away. But there are so many who accept that there is a God and then sadly misunderstand him. And they also haven't grasped the point, the details, the wonder of God's plan with Jesus at its centre. On the classes I was mentioning to Brother George before, one of our well-known speakers recently made the point that Christianity did not start out as a philosophy. It came about because of a very specific part of God's purpose. Jesus came on a rescue mission. Far too many people who would say that they believe in God don't see him as an involved and very active part of that plan which he devised. This is something I've alluded to over many years in what I've said. People imagine that God, even if they accept that God is involved in some way, they just think he did it and that's it. Now, of course, others, the majority of the human race, don't accept the Bible as his word. They don't accept it as an accurate narrative of his dealings with his creation and an explanation of how he works and how his plan will unfold. But you cannot get into the detail, the vast amount of detail that we find in our scriptures, without realizing there must be something special here. Of course, over the years, we as a community have striven to counter those doubts, that ignorance, you might say, that careless attitude, that unsure approach to religion. And we've done it in many ways. Obviously, you're familiar here with the Bible exhibition, and it's now 15 years ago coming up, when I was leading the campaign in Watford and St Albans, which featured the Bible exhibition, but we also included the presentation, again authored by Brother John Thorpe, the Bible on Trial, which we've had in this region as well. And you might say, well, if people are asking questions of trust and of acceptability to thinking man, how can that match? Well, there's so much of that there. A lot of it has of course influenced Brother John's work also in the Bible Online work that the ALS have gone for in the last few years. I've just got a few headline points here. Things with which we're familiar. But when we put all these together and keep adding to them, you realise the power of this evidence. There's the unity of the message. There's the consistency of the message. Over 40 writers, different places, different possessions, over 14 centuries and 3 languages. If you have ever been involved in work of bringing together various colleagues perhaps or friends and bringing together some thoughts, you'll know how difficult it is to get them to write and make sense consistently. But this, the Bible, and of course there are many other things that we as a community have often pointed to. The undesigned coincidences. One which we'll come to shortly in our readings, of course, is at the beginning of the book of Joshua, where we're told that as the nation went to conquer the land, it was the time of Passover. And what did Rahab hide the spies under? The flax harvest. It's the right time of year. A minor detail, but correct. You know, just occasionally, somebody, an avid reader, will spot an error of fact in one of their favourite writers, or maybe you heard of people who spotted an inconsistency in the way in which the continuity team have failed to get a movie linking up properly. There's no raw edges in the Bible. There's no missteps. And of course, it then gets quite amazing when you start looking at the Bible as against other ancient documents. Now this morning I mentioned this set of classes of God's view of history. And it is quite astonishing. The very first few slides of my PowerPoint, I showed a picture of the history book that we bought when our girls were young. And the first page of that book covers the first 1,000 years of human history, giving the Jewish year of the start of the world as being BC 3790, I think it is. And you then think, hang on, that's 1,000 years with just one page that mankind does not know went on. God was there, and Moses, having been told by God, writes down what happened. The whole of the Old Testament period, 4,000 years, is covered in 25. These are double page spreads, 25 pages of a book that thick. Man doesn't know what went on. God does. And his record bears that out. And anything that man finds bears testament to it. So it's not just the history that is consistent. But of course, along comes the archaeologist and we find it's consistent and verifiable. As well, of course, the text. I always remember reading what Brother John had put in that presentation about the fact that many of the great works of Greek philosophers and poets, there's just one or two copies. That's all survived. The scriptures, we have plenty of copies to be sure this is the right thing we're reading. And then, of course, one of our favourite topics, brothers and sisters and friends, prophecy. Only God could possibly know what was going to happen in advance in this way. And it's interesting to note how that power is then given not only to his son. I love the point when Jesus says, go into the city, you'll get the Passover ready, the guy will come and meet you. Jesus knew that the man with the pot of water would be there ready to meet the disciples. The prophet was able to reassure the nation that even though they seemed to be in a terrible situation, trapped in the valley, no water, that tomorrow morning that riverbed will be full of water for you. That's just an ordinary man who'd become a prophet of God, who could say that despite the adverse, from that point of view, weather conditions, suddenly there would be water for them and they would survive. Minor things. But then, of course, we come to the great detail of prophecy. For instance, in Isaiah 13, concerning Babylon, we have a couple of verses with several points. Babylon was to fall. That great empire, it was to be completely destroyed. Really? It was never to be rebuilt. Oh. And it was to remain uninhabited. Unthinkable. But that is exactly what happened. Babylon, captured by the Persians, fell into long decline as it became ruined and its population shrank. By 100 years before the birth of Christ, its last inhabitants were gone. And it was in the early 19th century that some biblical critics weighed in, claiming that Babylon had never existed at all. It was a figment of Old Testament writers' imagination. And then along comes archaeology. How often does something just come along at the right time? Another example of the impact of archaeology is the stance of the Bible minimalists, who require direct archaeological confirmation for any detail of the Bible. The problem is that there are bound to be some events that have left no trace, or other events where the traces exist but have simply not been found as yet. And that it was the example of the matter of King David. Until relatively recently, it was 1993, when archaeologists had found no direct evidence of King David. And so the Bible minimalists declared victory. David didn't exist at all. Such a central plank of the way the Old Testament hangs together. He did not exist. He was a mythical figure invented by the later people who wrote the Bible. The books published with that assertion presented as fact. And shortly after one of those such books was published, an inscription was discovered in 93. It was a victory inscription left in the biblical city of Dan by a Syrian king who claimed to have defeated both the king of Israel and the king of Judah. The king of Judah is known by the phrase, the king of the house of David. The inscription was made shortly after the time of David and thus confirms that David existed, was king of Israel, and founded a royal dynasty as described in the Bible. The minimalists were proved wrong. Of course there are gaps in the archaeological record by the very nature of it. But what is important is not that there are gaps, but nothing has been found to contradict the Bible. And so we could go on. There is, of course, the outstanding example of the hygiene laws contained within the law of Moses. I was quite shocked when I realised how recent this was. Only, again, the 19th century, when an Austrian doctor proposed that his colleagues should wash hands as a matter of hygiene. He was laughed to ridicule, and Dr. Semmelweis ended his days in a mental institution. But he had actually managed to prove his case in reality. He insisted that his colleagues washed their hands between examining post-mortem the mothers who had died and their babies who had died overnight before going to deal with the expectant mothers and the newborn. It's shocking just how many lives are wasted because of ignorance. Ignorance of the law of Moses and the simple thought that a scientist could have had of saying, why is there so much insistence on washing in the law of Moses? Of course, we have the big subject of the existence of God himself. And again, that same Macedonian Bible School, Brother Andrew produced a copy of the book by Flew. Not his original pamphlet, which was hailed as the great dissertation for the atheists who were rallying to that cry. But then Flew, well, this is really a whole lecture in itself, how he looked into these things properly and took his pamphlet, which was called There Is No God, and the front page of the new pamphlet just crossed out the word no with the word scribbled on it. There is a God. But it's not just that there is a God. It's not just that we are not alone because he has given us his word. It's not just that we are not alone because he sent his son and he has a whole purpose. That would be more than enough. But of course, there's a very special way in which we are not alone. Of course, it's dealt with in detail in one of the lessons in the CBM 40 lesson course, which is what was translated into Farsi and so many of our Iranian brothers and sisters have studied to come to the truth. But also, of course, there is the CMPA booklet, Angels, God's Messengers. Some more figures for you. Not quite as many as the kilometres between here and the exoplanet, but the references to angels. In the King James Version, there are 194 and 92 verses in the two parts. Well over 300 angels are encountered when you count the fact that some of those occurrences in both Old and New Testament involve multiple angels. Before you get any further, you've got over 300 angels mentioned in the Bible. Now, you then get a couple of very special occasions. When God broke that 400-year silence after condemnation through Malachi, a single angel went and told the shepherd This was the... yes, I know Gabriel had been to see Elizabeth, he'd been to see Mary. But this was the public moment that God broke his silence. And an angel went to see some shepherds, joined shortly by a multitude of the heavenly host, whatever a multitude is. And if you do the sums in Matthew 26 verse 53, Jesus said that he could call on 60,000 angels just like that. So God's Spirit being servants, messengers, interveners, supporters, the angels. There are so many of them. As we know, there is the reference to unknowingly meeting angels. And there are examples of people who encountered angels and didn't realise it to start with. Now, there are many times in the Old Testament when an angel takes the name Lord. The Lord this, the Lord that. And in fact, we know it was an angel representing God. There are many such examples. And as I say, we know that some have entertained angels unaware of that. But quite simply, and quite stunningly, the reason we can be so confident that we are not alone is just a little snippet of a verse at the end of the Gospel record, Matthew 28. And interestingly, the use of the phrase with you in the Bible, nearly half of those don't refer to being with you, etc., in the ordinary sense of the word, but they refer to a relationship with God and or Jesus. With you, says God, Jesus. And of course Jesus said, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world."